welcome to Soul Brothers. This is Nathan.
And this is Keith. That was awesome.
Oh, I just couldn't help it. It's just coming out. You know, it's there. That's kind of day we're in for.
It was very soulful.
Well, I don't know about that, but I'm trying. I mean, I'm native, so I got something going on.
There you go. Oh man. So, if you've been with us, you know that we just came out of a number of episodes on covenant, and really, it's time, I think, that we not only bridged off of that, but shifted to some of the topics that have been sent in to us. And we've had a few of those, which are just fantastic topics. We're probably going to tackle them most likely one at a time and spread those throughout the coming episodes. But there's one today that I think that really ties into what we've been talking about, and that is marriage.
Marriage. What brings us together today?
Let's talk about love and marriage.
Yes.
So we've had a few questions related to marriage, but I think before we get into the specific questions, let's talk about marriage in the frame of a covenant.
Mm-hmm. It's
my understanding that marriage itself is indeed a covenant.
Mm-hmm.
So, it sounds like I'm right about that.
You're definitely right about that.
So, from a let's start with Old Covenant, Old Testament. Give us a breakdown, if you will, about how that is seen, how that comes to pass, and how it is indeed a covenant. And I think that will help us bridge to some of the other questions we have about it.
Yeah. Okay. We can start with marriage in general from, an ancient Near Eastern understanding, or just a Jewish understanding from that time. It was both covenantal and contractual. So this is kind of like beyond, like the new covenant is a pure, unadulterated, one-sided covenant in a sense. We kind of talked about that. But a marriage covenant in the ancient Near East, it did involve contractual understandings and obligations. Okay. So if you didn't hold your end of the bargain up, there were certain parameters by which you could get divorced.
Okay.
But anyway, just so you know, it's kind of interesting to think about how we do weddings now, mm-hmm. and a lot of the cultural carryovers. So, for instance, if you remember, if I was going to get married and I'm entering into covenant, it is a serious, lifelong, binding covenant. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't just involve me; it would involve me, the other person, and each of our families. So both families, of course, they're arranged. Nobody got married willy-nilly, right?
Yeah.
So it was they're arranged.
Nobody was out on eHarmony necessarily, and then 3 days later we're married.
Yeah, no.
Not that that's a bad way to find somebody.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. But anyway, no, there really isn't. That's not a judgment at all. If God does that for you, praise God. Awesome.
It's a way.
Yeah, that's absolutely legit. So go for it. But anyway, it was... Everyone had to agree. So as you'll see, all the bridesmaids at a wedding dress the same, and all the groomsmen dress the same typically, mm-hmm. right? That comes from a Jewish understanding of covenant. So in other words, if I invited you to the wedding, I would Jesus talks about this. Remember when he said, he invites all these people to come to the wedding feast? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So in this whole parable about he initially sends them out to the main honored guests or whatever, and they're nobody comes, and so he's well, that sucks. So just go invite everybody, essentially, anybody you can find. And of course he's talking about the new covenant being offered to the Jewish people, and, mm-hmm. and them rejecting it, and then go invite everybody else. So of course that's what he's talking about. But remember the guy that shows up, and it's you're reading this, and it's he's not wearing the right clothes. Remember that?
No.
Oh yeah. So the
I
guy.
I don't remember that.
Yeah.
At
So
all.
in the parable, this guy shows up, and the the guy who's over the wedding, the father over the wedding, goes "Dude, you're not wearing the right clothes. Burn in hell forever." You remember that? So anyway, this is basically what happens. He's "You're cast in outer darkness." Well, if you're reading this as a Westerner, and you're kind of going, man, that seems a bit harsh, he just didn't wear the right clothes. What in the world? But if
there's a dress code.
Yeah, well, there is. So in other words, so what he's talking about in that passage is an ancient Near Eastern wedding, a Jewish wedding, that I would send you clothes. So if you were invited to the wedding, for you to then be in agreement with the covenant, you would show up wearing the clothes. That was your way of saying, I agree with this covenant, and I will then enter in with this covenant by virtue of the clothes you sent me, which is why even today, again, everybody wears the same clothes, right? Because they're trying to reflect, or at least keep going, that is where that tradition comes from. So I would need to wear that clothes. So that's why the father basically was saying to this guy, he showed up at the wedding feast because he was invited, but what he didn't do was wear the clothes.
Okay.
And what does that mean? Well, and he got cast into outer darkness. Well, why did he cast into outer darkness for not wearing the right clothes? Well, because he wanted to show up and have the benefits of the feast without the covenant. You see what I mean? So he wasn't willing to enter into the covenant. And Jesus was saying, look, you can't just show up and essentially enjoy all of the,
rights and privileges
of the kingdom without entering covenant. That was what he was saying. So he was saying, like, you can't just do that. You can't just show up. There's a covenant involved here. And that's why he got cast out. So, again, like I was saying, an ancient Near Eastern wedding was the same way. You would have to have, and so that's why, in our weddings today, you typically say, if anyone here can think of any reason why these two people should not destroy their lives, speak now. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, or forever hold your peace.
Right, and that actually came from what they would do in the covenant. They would say, if anyone here can have a reason why this covenant is unfair or unholy, you could speak up at that time and then break that covenant, because you're saying, like, no, I believe there's deception involved, or whatever it was, for somebody to say, because they were contractual covenantal agreements.
Wow.
So yeah,
I had no clue. and I'm going to have a different question based on that in a little bit. So it is a covenant and a contractual agreement. And if I understand correctly, Jewish weddings for however long back in history, these weren't like modern weddings where you show up, you hear the vows. It's just a few, maybe an hour or so. You go to the reception, you're done by, midnight, whatever. These are like multiple day parties, correct?
Oh man. A Jewish wedding would at least be 3 days, maybe as long as 10 days, depending on how rich you were. So how long you could feed people is basically what it boiled down to. Like, how much wine do you have? We have the miracle wine at a wedding because they were running out of wine. So this was probably a fairly wealthy person that was able to keep these people wasted for a long time.
Yeah.
And then, have the food to feed them as well. So it could last as long as 10 days. So in the course of that, so after the contract and the covenant was then sealed and ratified in everyone's sight and in the sight of God, then the married couple would then go off to what's called the consummation tent. Mm-hmm. So there would literally be a tent right in the middle of this huge party, which I think is kind of interesting, because we're talking about, there's kids all over the place, right?
Yeah.
There's little kids, which I think is kind of cool, honestly, because I think that I obviously keep my kids from any sort of talk about sexuality until they're mature enough, or maybe they start asking questions. And of course, when they start asking questions, we're very upfront and very transparent about the whole thing. In fact, my wife got a book that's actually a really cool book, because she's actually done the book now with all of our kids who have sort of reached that point.
It's not Passport to Purity, is it?
Oh, no, I don't even know what that is.
So, it's a whole different episode right there.
No, it's just a very straightforward, like, this is what it is. And, but anyway, that I think it's kind of cool, because, you have kids coming around and they would probably ask questions. So a healthy, normal sexual encounter would have been okay in their culture. It wouldn't have been so taboo and so over dramatized, to the point where, or just perverted, like we have in our culture. Like, I've seen different abuses of it. Maybe this isn't the time for this, but maybe it is, where you either have such a perversion and a denigration, of course, in the culture of sexuality and of virginity, that it doesn't matter anymore. It's like, it's like putting on a new pair of underwear. Like, you just go from partner to partner. What does Dan Aykroyd said? Hop from bed to bed, like with the frequency of a cheap ham radio. Yeah. Like that kind of attitude has kind of pervaded the culture, to the point where, like, you being intimate with someone sexually is almost like high-fiving someone in the hallway. I mean, it's just been degraded, and that's because of pornography and all the perversion. So obviously that's there. But then what I saw, I don't know if you are aware of this, but when I first became a youth pastor in the late 90s and in the early zeros, the pendulum had swung way to the other side. So we had guys like Josh McDowell, like a Kiss Dating Goodbye and that kind of a thing. And so we began having purity banquets. Are you familiar with this?
I have, and this is where you have the purity rings and things
Yes.
like that. Yeah.
And you have these purity banquets, purity rings, and all these people make these very public, I mean, they went all I remember wearing tuxes.
I do remember those.
Did you go to
Yeah.
any of those?
I never went to one, but
Okay.
I do remember them.
I held one. Actually, I held a couple as a
Okay.
youth pastor. I was just thinking, like, I guess this is the thing to do because all the other youth groups were doing it. I was like, well, man, I want my kids to be pure. I want them to be,
Yeah.
like walking the, you know what I'm saying? Like, this seemed like a good idea. Like, why isn't this a good idea? And I don't think it was necessarily a bad idea, but where I saw it go, it got weird. It got to the point where, like, your virginity was like the core of every single thing you are, the most important thing you have in the universe. And it almost like got exalted to being like worshipped. And what I discovered, and you don't see these almost at all anymore. Like, you don't see purity banquets and purity rings and all this kind of, not that you don't ever see them, but you don't see them very often.
Not as
Like,
frequent.
not as frequently, like purity banquets and stuff. And the reason is because most of the kids who did that, and again, I'm not saying all of them, certainly there was a lot of kids who kept the covenant and praise God that they walked that out. I know some myself who were part of the youth group that I led at the time that we had them for, and they definitely kept the covenant, and praise God, that was awesome. I got to do a lot of their weddings where they were all virgins when they got married, and it was just an amazing, beautiful thing, right? Especially in this culture to be able to do that. But there was a whole bunch of the other ones who didn't. And almost it was, I don't want to say caused by these banquets, but it was almost like the overemphasis and the exaltation to the point where it was like, this is my entire reason for being. And if they did lose it or they did, fool around or fall in a certain sexual way, it just devastated them.
So they found their identity in it.
Yes.
As opposed to finding it in the right place and that being a reflection of your identity.
Exactly.
Okay.
It was like all of their identity and all of their self-worth was wrapped up in their virginity instead of wrapped up in who they are in Christ Jesus.
Yeah.
So it sounded like a good idea, but it got kind of weird sort of early on. But anyway,
Well, I can see this is a slight tangent. I mean, have you seen lately there are people marrying themselves
I've seen this.
and having full ceremonies for this?
I haven't seen that.
Oh yeah.
I've heard about that, but I haven't seen
full
that.
ceremonies for this
real?
stuff. Yeah.
Like, do they have an actual, like a pastor or like somebody else, or are they just
They have
marrying themselves to themselves?
I don't know if pastor's the right term.
Okay, yeah.
They have somebody officiating.
Wow.
And yeah, I mean, there's like tuxes and dresses
They
and
marry
flowers
themselves.
and yep.
Is this a legal thing you can do, or is this just
I
like,
don't know if it's legal, but it's certainly out there.
okay, so this isn't something like the government would recognize, it's just something people are doing?
Well, nowadays, who knows what the government's going to
Yeah, I
recognize?
guess
I mean,
that's
quite
true.
honestly.
That's so weird.
Yeah, I mean, it's unusual. And so I guess they've entered into covenant with themselves.
With yourself.
which would make it easy for somebody to die if you broke covenant.
Say that again.
So if you have to die to break covenant,
Oh, I see. Wow.
there's only one person to worry about.
That's really weird. Okay.
So there you go.
Okay. Well, I've heard of that happening. I didn't realize how elaborate that had become. That just shows you kind of where we're at right now in terms of where we are as a culture. But I mean, let's go back to the actually how things should be. So,
Yeah, let's go back to the tent.
yeah, the tent. So again, having children kind of be introduced to a healthy sexuality. But just so everybody knows, it's just really kind of cool that, okay, so the married couple would then go into the consummation tent as the party went on the outside. So all of your friends and relatives are right outside the tent, literally right outside the tent, eating, drinking, carrying on, eating lamb or whatever, like having a great time, like doing their thing. And you as the man had the responsibility. Well, okay, so let me put it to you this way. You were expected to, of course, consummate the marriage, which would require a breaking of the hymen. So once the hymen tears, of course, it produces some blood and some just a little bit, maybe some girls quite a bit, but it produces some blood, which is always interesting to mention that God actually puts in a blood sacrifice, sort of, not a sacrifice, but puts in a blood component into the consummation of the marriage, which is why most Jewish thought believes that that's why hymens are there in the first place, is to actually have the blood available as the covenant is consummated.
As a real blood covenant.
As an actual real blood covenant. Yeah, and the blood is there. So as a tradition, as you were the husband and you then consummated the marriage, you were required to grab a sheet, a white sheet that should be covered in blood, supposedly the sheet on which you were consummating the marriage. And then the blood is, of course, considered to have then come from the torn hymen, which means now the covenant is ratified, because it's ratified both through consummation and blood. So you have the hymen that is now torn, and the sheet is now soaked with blood. And as a man, you would walk outside in the middle of the party, and you would hold up the sheet, and you would wave the sheet around, and everybody would cheer. Everybody, the whole place would stop, and everybody would cheer, and everybody would scream, and they would dance, and it would be this great moment because you were saying, like, here it is, So I know some of you are thinking, like, wow, like, I don't remember my hymen bleeding enough to soak a sheet. And, most women don't. I think that would be fairly unusual. So an astute bridesmaid, it was her job to basically put a cup of lamb's blood or something like that right next to the bed, so that in case the hymen had maybe been broken from something before, which if you don't know is quite common, for women to have broken hymens for a whole bunch of different reasons that have nothing to do with sexual intercourse. Like, some women tear with tampons. My older sister actually tore because she was in gymnastics, and she went to go do a flip on the balance beam and literally landed on her crotch and tore open her hymen. So, you could tear it open from horseback riding. You maybe get kicked there, a ball hits. There's a lot of ways for the hymen to tear outside of actual sexual intercourse. But in any case, if there wasn't enough blood, which I imagine typically there wasn't, the bridesmaid's job was to have that cup of blood there. So you as a man would take it and pour it on the sheet, and then you would do the same thing, and everybody would cheer and, go, wow, it's consummated. There we go.
But the cheering itself and I guess the pride of the moment, and pride is probably not the best word, but the joy of the moment is in the fact that the covenant means so much. It's not a light thing. It's not something to be taken lightly. It's not something that's just a casual occurrence. It is a true binding of two becoming one.
Right. Which is the original plan, of course, right?
Yeah.
What did God say in Genesis? The man shall leave his father and mother, cleave, and the two shall become
one flesh.
One flesh. Yeah. So the original plan laid out very clearly is one man, one woman becoming one flesh.
You want me to hyper spiritualize this story for a second?
Go for it.
So it occurs to me that kind of the backup plan, at least, if not the making sure everything is truly, I guess, captured for everybody to know that covenant is there, that it's lamb's blood.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's pretty awesome, right?
That's pretty much the theme.
Yeah. I mean, of course, you see that through all the Old Testament, like leading up to Jesus, the Lamb of God. Like you see that all being like all part of the covenant, which, it's just an amazing thing. I mean, even that God builds blood in, to initial sexual intercourse, to have the hymen tear, and to have literally that's how it's now then consummated. That's just kind of an amazing thing to think about.
Yeah, we were talking about it earlier today. Just there are times in life where you shouldn't be amazed by what God does, because you should know, he's God.
Yeah.
And he's awesome.
Yeah.
But still, even what seems to be the smallest detail, he's got it covered. I mean, he is that amazing.
Yes.
It's mind blowing to me.
It is.
Even though it should just be, it's God.
But at the same time, it's like, I agree. I mean, we shouldn't have our minds blown, but then we should.
Yeah.
Right?
That
it's
makes
like,
sense.
It's kind of like, we shouldn't, because we should expect it, but at the same time, our minds should still be blown at the awesomeness of God, even if it happens all the time, which it does. But it's still amazing. At the same time, we shouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
This is who God is.
And maybe that goes back to the overuse of terms like amazing or awesome.
Right.
Because truly, that is amazing.
That is amazing.
So,
Yeah.
so the covenant's ratified in this way in a Jewish wedding,
Mm-hmm.
and it's celebrated
Mm-hmm.
to be such an amazing covenant between, and you've referenced Genesis, where the two become one flesh. So here's a question.
Yes.
Even though that's mentioned, and even though that was followed, Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
we do see a lot of instances in the Old Testament where there are multiple wives,
Yes.
sometimes concubines for men. There's polygamy. There's all sorts of things. Why is that the case?
It's all your fault, Keith. That's,
Listen,
you're just too darn good looking. Just attracted them all. That's what it is. So
listen. On my best day, I'm barely managing one.
no, I totally get it too. I'm like, I gotta pour my all into my wife, and I'm not even like, I still don't think I'm doing the best bang up job here, but I'm doing the best I can. So no, I get that. Yeah, to our listeners, you might think like, why bring up the subject of polygamy? Like, who even thinks like this? Like, I think I don't know how people are thinking, but I think most people probably would think like, why should we even talk about this? Like this, isn't
Well,
this?
there's been a resurgence in this lately
Right.
in culture, in society.
Yes, which is why I think it's pertinent that we talk about it. And we have to really ask ourselves why. And I want to hear your thoughts on this too, but my thoughts on why boils down to when you begin to pervert covenant, and then of course you then get a perversion of sexuality in general. I mean, you begin to open the door for anything, which is essentially what we're seeing now. A lot of weirdness. So you see, essentially, I don't know if you're, I'm sure you're kind of aware of this, but we only have one absolute moral left in our culture. There's only one, and that absolute moral is consent, and that's it. In other words, in our culture right now, the vast majority of people by polling, we're talking in the 80 percentile now, and in the 90 percentile if you're talking under 25, people will basically absolutely anything goes as long as it's consensual. So that's literally the only absolute moral in terms of sexual behavior, or in terms of almost any behavior, but in particular sexual behavior, just consent, which is a really scary thing if you think about it. But it's why most people would still, at least praise God, be against like polygamy. Because we have this idea, and it's a good idea, that kids cannot give consent. I mean, they're too young to give consent, which is why we have the age of consent, right, in different states and stuff like that, which is good that we have that. We need to have that. But again, just the fact that we're saying like somehow consent is, I mean, think about what that means. I mean, do you know how abused and mistreated and defiled that someone has to be to give consent to certain behaviors?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it's like, like this is where we are. But somehow if they give consent and they're adults, like then everything's okay. And it's like, this is not okay.
Yeah.
No.
Permission and agreement doesn't make it right.
No. And again, if you abuse somebody, I've seen it many times. If you abuse someone, manipulate someone, control someone, and defile someone enough, they'll consent to just about anything.
It's terrible.
Yeah, it doesn't make it okay. But that's why we have this open door to polygamy. Because it's the same thing. It's like when you open the door like that to all this perversion, then you're going to open the door to every kind of perversion, and polygamy is one of those perversions.
Yeah.
So let's state that very clearly, and I'm stating that as a theologian, that the polygamy is a perversion of the original and best intent of God as we have laid out in Genesis and really throughout the scriptures. But we'll get to the references you talked about, I'm sure.
Yeah. So let me play. I don't even want to say devil's advocate, but let me pepper you with challenging questions.
All right.
Against what you just said.
Okay, Pepper.
So get ready to defend.
Oh boy.
Okay. But Nathan,
Yes.
I have read the Old Testament. We have all sorts of things that are both in alignment with polygamy and could be seen as just as, I don't know, you might see them as just as crazy now, or maybe just as acceptable now to some. So let's talk about those, right?
Yes.
So certainly Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived.
pretty low bar.
Scripture tells us
Yes,
he
yes.
is the wisest dude ever to live.
Yes. Up to that point, anyway.
Up to the
Jesus was wiser. But go ahead.
man. Well, that's true. He had so many wives, he couldn't even count them.
Right. They just rounded it.
Yeah.
700. It's good.
That's close
I
enough.
always get confused if it's 700 wives and 300 concubines or 300 wives, 700. Anyway, whatever.
Yeah.
We rounded it anyways.
And when you have 700 wives and you're a concubine, don't you? I mean, you're like, come on, man.
Yeah.
Like it's like the minor leagues of marriage.
I
What
know.
is this?
Yeah,
It's
I know
terrible.
it is. Yeah, it's kind of like the ghetto version of
Yeah.
marriage.
So,
Yeah.
but he's the smartest guy ever to live. He's
Right.
he's blessed. He was king.
Right. So address
Why
this.
not? Yeah.
Okay. So, first of all, we have in Deuteronomy, and I actually don't know if I have the exact scripture. I might have it right here. We have in Deuteronomy a basically not a blanket prohibition, but we definitely have a warning against polygamy. So I want to say, yeah. So in Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20, God basically says that kings were not to have multiple wives. In other words, so in Deuteronomy 17, we have kind of already in the Old Testament, we have not a blanket prohibition, but certainly a wise call to kings to they basically says, do not have multiple wives like your surrounding people do. Their surrounding kings are like, this is a bad idea. So let's just look at Solomon, period. So obviously Solomon was probably the richest man that ever lived in the history of the world up to that point. And it talks about, even when we're talking about Solomon being wise, it's interesting because it doesn't mean he's wise in all things, because clearly he wasn't. And so it's just obvious that he wasn't. Clearly he was wise in a lot of things, but it's clearly he was not wise in this respect. Because first of all, he didn't follow that command by saying don't have a lot of wives. He violated that, so that's stupid. That's not wise at all. And then the second thing he does is clearly the scripture talks about, because he took in a whole bunch of wives and then specifically took in foreign wives, he actually fell then into idolatry because he violated Deuteronomy 17 and took in a whole bunch of wives. Once again, not a wise thing to do. And yet that's what he does. So it seems like his wisdom was about knowing what to do and solving problems, and not so much governing his actual behavior, because when you see it happen, he falls into idolatry. That's not wise. He violates Deuteronomy 17 by having a whole bunch of wives. Not wise. So we don't see a positive, description of this instance. In fact, we see quite negatively. So we never see God going yeah, go Solomon, that was amazing, keep on having wives. You just don't see that.
700 more.
Yeah, exactly. Keep on going. You just don't see that. And in fact, you see the opposite of that. So even in the Old Testament, you have God saying, don't do this, don't have a lot of wives, at least especially to this degree. And then the second thing is, again, you see them in Solomon's case specifically leading to idolatry. So this was unwise even then. But if we want to broaden now the kind of why polygamy was in general.
Absolutely. Well, let me ask you one more question.
Yeah.
Before you go there. What about Jacob and Rachel and Leah?
Right. Well, again, the same kind of a thing that we're going to see here coming down the pike. And there's a lot of different aspects to Jacob and Leah and Rachel. But let's go beyond that into the bigger picture.
Okay.
So again, the bigger picture here is that in the Old Testament times, and it's still true in some ancient or some Near Eastern countries and some Middle Eastern countries, but in the ancient Near East, if you were a woman, of course, you could not work, especially under Jewish law. You couldn't work at all. There was no way for you to support yourself at all outside the home. So the only way you're going to be provided for is either, hopefully, you have family members who could take you in, or you get married. I mean, that's the only way you can do it. And then your lineage and you yourself will be preserved and carried on. So there was a whole bunch of reasons why that's not how I wanted to phrase it. God allowed it at some level because it helped women in that time.
Okay.
So in other words, if you were a woman who had been previously married, nobody married you. No one would marry you. I mean, they just wouldn't, because you're used up goods. If you're a woman past a certain age, nobody would marry you. If you had any reputation at any level for any reason for being anything other than perfectly holy and pure all the time, nobody's taking you. Nobody's going to marry you. And so here are your options. As an unmarried woman, if your family won't take you in, which probably they wouldn't, maybe they would if they had a lot of mercy on you. Here's your options. You become a prostitute, a slave, or you die. Those are your options. So you starve to death, you become a prostitute, or you become a slave. That's
not
all
a promising future whatsoever.
No, those are your career prospects. So that's all you can do. And that's hideous and just awful. I mean, just and degrading.
In any time or culture.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. What an awful thing. So in part, some men who had a lot of money and wealth and ability could take in some of these women and marry them as part of all their wives. Because then if they were to marry you as a wife, now you have all the rights and privileges of a wife. Now your lineage can continue, especially if you have sons. And so now you have financial security, you have familial security, you have all that stuff that you would not have had under any other circumstances. And your kids are now going to be taken care of as well. So in that sense, it was kind of like it was a mercy, aspect to it. Not that God was like, this is how I want you guys to show mercy. We still don't see ever God saying, this is the way I want it to be. Like, we never see that.
He never sets it up as the ideal state.
Correct. But you can see an allowance being made because of the hardness of hearts and the nature of the culture. And this actually brings up a bigger theological concept, which is the idea of progressive revelation. So have you heard that?
No.
Okay, so the idea of progressive revelation, and this is, again, a theological concept that covers the whole Bible, is that some people are like, well, why doesn't, God say, like all the things that Jesus said, for instance, like he ups the bar, essentially, under the new covenant. Like, why wasn't that in the beginning? Well, that's because when God chose the Jewish people in that particular place, in that particular time, they had a level of culture that you can't just come in and destroy the entire thing. So the idea of progressive revelation is that God begins to reveal more and more of himself over time, so that he introduces into a culture what that culture can absorb without destroying it. So he introduces certain things that will bring them to know both who he is and who they are, and bring them into covenant. But he can't do it all at once because it would completely destroy the culture and be totally rejected. So God couldn't do that out of love. Like, once again, he could just obliterate everything, I guess, but that's not who he is. Yeah. He wants everyone to enter in through love and through their own free will. So the idea of progressive revelation, which you see all the way through the scriptures, is that God begins to slowly introduce into the Jewish thought who he is, what he's about, and begins to progressively do that over time. So progressive revelation just reveals more and more of God to a particular culture so that they can absorb it and change with it and be able to acquiesce in love to it. And it doesn't just wipe them out completely. So that's why you have the progressive revelation over time. Then, of course, with Jesus, you then have the fullness of the revelation, and not only the fullness of the revelation of who God is. I don't mean everything about who God is. I'm just saying, like, the fullness of the revelation that's going to be given, especially in terms of written revelation. But that you have the ability, because through the cross and the blood and the resurrection and the sacrifice, you not only know what it is, you're actually given grace and power and given a changed nature to actually then live it out, which wasn't there before. So through progressive revelation, you had their culture was already highly polygamous at that time. And again, mostly just as a result of cultural norms, like women in an act of mercy, towards women. It was a way that women could escape prostitution and slavery and death. Was to, it's better to marry this dude and hang out, and get some food than it is to be a prostitute, for sure, but over time, obviously, by the time of Jesus, just so everybody knows, Pharisees, for instance, or anybody that was at the top of Jewish religion at that time, Pharisees, Sadducees, anybody, you could only marry one woman. In fact, you were required to marry a woman as a Pharisee. Like, you couldn't be a Pharisee without being married. And you could only marry one woman, and that was very, very much the norm and the standard at that time, at the time of Jesus, for that to be the case.
So let's go back to Rachel, Leah, and Jacob.
Yeah.
I mean, is that what's going on there? Is it a mixture of cultural norm? Mm-hmm. And I mean, if if you were having, who would Jacob have had mercy on? The first wife?
Well, think back farther. Like, how do you remember how he got them in the first place? I mean, what was Jacob's intent?
He worked.
Right, but who did he want first?
Well, he wanted Rachel first.
Right, and then what? Okay, Rachel was older or younger? You remember?
Rachel was younger.
Correct. So in their culture, you cannot marry the younger one, the younger daughter, if there is an older one. It's incredibly disrespectful. In fact, this probably wouldn't have been allowed at all, or you would have been required to pay. So, in fact, I encountered this with I can't remember. There's an Asian culture. Oh my gosh, there's a girl that was part of this Asian culture, and I cannot remember the name for the life of me. But she was a good friend of mine at seminary. Would always sit right next to me. She's from some kind of Asian culture. It's a small community, but you would totally know.
Okay.
If I were to, it's like starts with an H, so maybe one of the listeners can like write in and go, it's the whatever. It was like ho or hi or anyway, some kind of Asian culture.
Okay.
And I'll never forget. She comes into me one day and I was just talking to her about do you want to get married? She's like, oh yeah, and all this stuff. She goes, oh, my sister's getting married this weekend. I was like, oh, that's cool, And she's like, yeah, she's my younger sister. She kind of says it really weirdly. And I kind of looked at her, and I'm kind of real sensitive anyway, so I'm feeling this shame,
Yeah.
And so I kind of asked her, like, are you okay? Like, are you okay with that? Like, is this kind of hurtful to you or whatever? And she goes, well, his husband was required to pay her $2,000. So her husband had to pay her $2,000 to offset the dishonor that her not being married first would convey on her. So she actually got $2,000 out of the deal. So I guess that's good. But she still felt, she still felt like, it was a very big dishonor for her not to be married first. So that is the same situation in the Jewish community. You would not have the older daughter. You'd have to have the older daughter be married first, because otherwise it would be a dishonor to her if the younger sister were to be married first. So that's why people understand when he's working, that was very common. That was not unusual. Like, he had to work, and then he had to have Leah first, right? Mm-hmm. Because that would then take the dishonor off of her. And then he was able to finally get the one he wanted, but that would have been then the right way to do it. Everyone's like, oh, Jacob, that stinks. He had to work forever. And I understand that, what's his name, Laban, was trying to, did some shady things and all that. Like, obviously that's not right. But he was within his rights to do so. Like in their culture, he was within his rights to require that.
Okay. So that kind of leads to contracted marriage, which we see a few times in Scripture. And I'm going to see if I can pull it up real quick. I should have had it up already. Genesis, where is it? 21, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. That's just one example of where mom would have arranged a marriage for somebody. So arranged or contracted marriages. We do still see this on occasion in multiple cultures. Yeah. Still. Is it necessarily a bad thing?
No. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I don't think you can make even that biblical argument. I think we live in a very westernized culture, and where personal decision is highly valued. And I guess you could make the argument that like personal decision unto love is the core of the covenant, which I totally agree with. So to have the personal decision to marry said person, I think maybe would be more new covenant. You could definitely argue that.
More of a free will entry into the covenant itself.
Exactly. But it doesn't mean that an arranged marriage is wrong, is somehow, morally wrong. I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to make a biblical argument for that. But, again, unless you want to argue the free will, the more your ability to make a choice, obviously plays better to love and to a new covenant, to be able to enter into that covenant through your own love for that person as opposed to just your contractual obligation to that person. So I think you could make that argument, but it wasn't, certainly that happens today. It was not unusual then at all. And I don't think that he was even necessarily wrong, So I don't see God being upset with that.
I saw a statistic once. I can't remember it. So, hey, how useful is that today? But it indicated that arranged marriages were more successful.
Yeah.
Ended up less likely in divorce than marriages that we might into freely on our own.
Yeah.
So, which I think says something, because it is, back to your comment earlier about it being a covenant arrangement between not just the man and the wife, but their families.
Exactly.
Really, that's what it is. The families are entering in
Right.
to that. So there's a lot of time invested into that. There's a lot of not research, but a lot of
Yeah.
a lot of relational
Yeah.
aspect to that before that ever really becomes the case. So
Yeah.
that might indicate right there that it.
Well, yeah, and I think it's even more because people tend to, not that it shouldn't be romantic. I think it should be romantic, but people tend to romanticize to the point where it's like becomes so much about feelings and
Yeah.
and like the daisies and all the roses. I mean, all that's fine. Like I'm not against any of that. That's all good, but that stuff doesn't last.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not powerful. It doesn't hold you through the fire.
Yeah,
you know?
Nathan, I blame Hallmark movies
Me too.
and promposals.
Darn you, Candace Cameron.
Cameron family.
Yeah. No, we got both the Camerons.
Now we got both of you. And that and promposals.
Oh yeah, totally. Those people are going to hell. They didn't do that stuff. Yeah, it's done. No matter what your relation with the Lord, you don't. That's like blasphemy down the list. The promposal nonsense. So, anyways, sorry. No, there's mercy, but not much for that kind of behavior. But yeah, so when you make marriage this kind of fluffy, well, like what we've done in our culture now, where it's like, why are people getting married? Because they love each other. Which, okay, that's fine, but it becomes just about these feelings between one another, as opposed to being about a covenant that's really to ensure health of children. I mean, that's one of the main reasons of a marriage covenant. I mean, I know people are like, well, there's a lot of people that can't have kids. Yeah, I completely get that. But that's the exception, of course, to the rule. But covenantal marriage is both for the two individuals involved, for their health, for their love and intimacy with one another and with the Lord, but also for the sake of the children. But we've stripped away all of that to where it's just like, I feel towards you, so I should be able to get married to you no matter what.
Yeah, and I think that's key too, because it's how society now defines love.
Right.
It's defined purely as emotion.
Right.
And solely as emotion.
Right.
So once that emotions can change,
Oh, yes.
they're pliable things,
Yes.
so they can change in any given circumstance and over
So
time.
true.
So if that's all you're basing it on,
Mm-hmm.
surely there needs to be a feeling there. You don't need to hate the person you're
Right.
married to, right?
Yeah, that'd be a bummer.
That
Yeah.
would not be good.
Yeah.
But, if all you're basing it on is the emotion itself, that is not a good foundation for any relationship,
Oh, absolutely.
much less marriage.
Absolutely. And I've always said love is absolutely not a feeling. Love can be felt and love should be felt, but it is not a feeling. It is it's an intricate part of what a covenant is. And it's about absolute honor and submission and laying down one's life. Yeah. That's what love is. And it isn't a feeling, but it can and should be felt. So that kind of covenant love should definitely be felt, but it isn't a feeling in and of itself.
Yeah, the feeling is like the heat from the flame.
Right.
Love is the flame. The feeling is the heat.
Exactly. And you're not always going to feel it,
Yeah.
right? I mean, the flame will always be there, but if you stand far enough away, you're not going to feel it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reasons why you might not feel it. And, we don't like those seasons, but at the deep core of your heart, it's like you still know it's there.
Yeah.
Whether it's raging at the moment or not,
So get close to your spouse and feel the heat.
Yeah.
Don't be distant.
Yes,
There
don't
you
be
go.
distant. So do you want to finish up this polygamy? Because
Absolutely.
being such a big issue, I shouldn't say a big issue, but certainly a resurgent issue. And I wanted to get into, of course, I think, did we answer that enough? Like Old Covenant, obviously there was an allowance, but never a celebration. We see the reason for it in the old, at least the positive aspect of it is protect women,
Yeah.
of course, to protect women and keep them safe. So you have to ask, is there any, well, first of all, did that change? And yes, obviously it never changed because the first thing we have in Genesis is one man, one woman. So that was always the ideal. Only a caveat was given because the culture was disgusting. So can we understand that? Like,
Yeah.
in other words, it was always one man and one woman, always from the beginning. The only reason that it was even allowed at any level was because the culture was so perverted that it treated women like garbage. So there was a bit of an allowance there in order for their sake. Because what you have to understand is right, the human population is binary. So and it is about half and half, almost exactly. So you have so when you have births, it's almost exactly 50-50, which is clearly designed that God's saying one man, one woman. Because as soon as one man has two women, well, now somebody's going to be robbed, aren't they? There's going to be a man out there who doesn't have a woman, and that's not right, and that's not righteous. Or a woman out there, I don't, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Who deserves one man's full focus and love, and not sharing it with four other women or whatever, the situation is, which is a definite perversion. So let's just get that real clear. But how do I know this? Like beyond that, well, Jesus reiterates this, right? Like, let each man have his own husband. Each, only allowed, like they ask him about Moses and divorce. You remember this?
Yeah.
And just in the ancient Near East, like if I wanted to divorce my wife, for any reason, so I could divorce my wife for absolutely any reason, and I could give her a certificate of divorce, and all I'd have to do is take all of her stuff and throw it outside, and she's divorced. That's literally all I'd have to do. So as a man, if I didn't like the way she cooked, or she smelled good one day, or whatever my issue was, I could take all of her stuff and throw it outside. And if she came home and saw her stuff, she was divorced, and she had no recourse for that whatsoever. And so, they had to then give a certificate of divorce, but those could be forgery, so basically women were still being treated like garbage. And Jesus says, look, you're going to stay with this woman forever. That was kind of his idea. Like, you don't just get to throw her away like trash. Because he was trying to then protect them and elevate them. Like, you don't just get to throw them away whenever you feel like it. So, you're going to stay married unless she cheats on you. That's a whole nother topic that maybe we don't need to get into now, because there's also a resurgence right now of like, if anybody gets divorced ever for any reason, like they can never get remarried, or they're like an adulteress or something.
Yeah, we're going to dive into divorce in a different episode for certain.
Yeah, but I don't want to go down that road now, because we're kind of focusing on the polygamy aspect of it. But that's why Jesus, and then Paul later on says, let each man have his own wife, and each woman her own husband, always singular. And by the way, all throughout the entire New Testament, what you have is singular man, or singular wife, singular husband. Like, it's always one man and always one woman. And then furthermore, when you have 1 Timothy 3:2, Titus 1:6, essentially say the same thing. So basically, the 1 Timothy scripture is Paul's writing Timothy and telling him, look, here's what you need to find in a leader, literally an overseer or an elder, or you could translate like that. So when you're looking for someone to be leader of a church, one of the things he says is, this is 1 Timothy 3:2, therefore an overseer must be above reproach, which of course that just means you live such a holy life that nobody could even accuse you of any wrongdoing. And he says the husband of one wife. The husband of one wife. So why would he say the husband of one wife? Literally, that could be translated a one-woman man. So one of the requirements, for leadership and eldership was that this person was married to one person. This is the ideal. This is what we're supposed to do. And I think Titus 1:6, says the same thing. If anyone is above reproach, just Titus 1:6. Again, the husband of one wife. Once again, or you could translate that yet again, a one-woman man. Like, so the ideal, the righteous, the holy, the people we want leading the church are men who would only be with one woman. Like, this is the ideal, and this is what we need, and this is what we should have, and this is what we should look for. So, I hope that kind of like adds the context to it. Is the original Genesis, one man, one woman, gets perverted into polygamy because people suck and cultures are terrible. And then Jesus goes, and then it even had changed before Jesus' time. Even before Jesus' time, the Jews understood that it was supposed to be one man and one woman. In covenant. And then Jesus reiterates this very strongly, and then makes that covenant very, very serious. Like, you can't just break it because you feel like it. You can't just throw her stuff out and get a certificate of divorce because you don't like her. Like, you can't do that. He makes it very serious. And then Paul continues that thought, which being like one man, one woman, over and over and over again throughout all of his letters, including his letters to Titus and Timothy, where he tells them, like, look, the leaders in the church need to only be men that are one woman men. Like, this is righteous, this is holy, this is what we need to be. So anybody today who says polygamy is good is sick and wrong. And I don't care, Joseph Smith was sick. And he had many wives, some as young as 14. And if there's a Mormon listening to this, I'm sorry to say that your leader definitely engaged in that behavior. There's no way you can dispute that at all. And it was wrong, and it was perverted, and it was demonic, and there was no way that that's okay ever. And so I want everyone to understand and hear this. There's a spirit behind polygamy that preys on vulnerable women who are hurting and need affection. So women who have been burned, hurt, divorced, raped, neglected, in any way, there's a huge wound. This spirit, I've seen it before, it preys on them. It goes after them, and it makes them feel good. It makes them feel loved. It makes them feel like, oh, I'm wanted. This person wants to marry me. This person wants to be with me and kind of restore some of my dignity because I can't seem to find anyone else. And then they fall into that. But as soon as they enter into that so-called marriage, which it isn't really a marriage, but as soon as they fall into that, they realize real quickly, I've actually counseled women from this, so I know what I'm talking about. They realize very quickly that this is not what they had anticipated, and it doesn't fill that ache in their heart that they had for affection, for affirmation, for belonging. It just doesn't fit it because it's not proper and it's not what God designed. And it just ends up being more hurtful than anything. This one particular person I'm talking about actually left her polygamous marriage, quote unquote. And had come to me for healing. She would be coming to the church. She had a kid that came to the youth group, so she was coming to the church to get some healing and some counseling. But this is one of her questions that she had asked me, these very things that we're talking about. But as you can see very clearly throughout the scripture, it's always one man, one woman. That's what's holy. That's what God always has. And it's only this spirit that preys on vulnerable, hurting women. And it just, kind of ticks me off. Like, it just makes me mad, and men who get involved in this, like, it's all about them. They'll make it sound like it's all about these women. I'm so magnanimous.
It sounds predatorial.
Yes, it's absolutely predatorial. And that's why there's almost no cult on the planet that doesn't involve some kind of sexual perversion. In fact, I don't know of any. Every cult I've ever studied, and I studied them both in psychology and then I studied them in seminary, but we had a huge section on cults in psychology and in seminary where we studied just a ton of them, and there was not one that didn't have sexual perversion at its core, and many of them had polygamy, just like Joseph Smith did with the Mormons, have this polygamy to end up with this bizarre doctrine and this really weird theology, again wrapped around sexual perversion and the spirit of polygamy.
Yeah, so what you defined as a need from many of these women, they're legitimate needs.
Absolutely.
The need to be wanted, desired, respected, valued in any way. But to me, it points back to what we've talked about before. Where do you find your identity?
Right.
If you find your identity in those things, and again, recognizing their legitimate human needs. The need for affection is a human need.
Yes.
Which is actually and can be a great thing.
Yeah.
When done correctly.
Right.
But when you find your identity in that, right? I don't have value unless somebody shows me affection. I don't have value unless somebody wants me as a bride or a husband or what have you. Then that's what allows the perversion in. But when you can find your identity in Christ, then really he fulfills every one of those needs already.
Absolutely.
And the closer you get to that and the more clear that becomes, that reality is in your own mind, the more you really grab hold of that, the more fulfilled you are.
Yes.
The more affection you feel, the more value you feel, the more wanted. I mean, listen, for God to take human form, to come and suffer, to die on the cross, that indicates to me that that's pretty wanted.
Yeah.
Right? Most people aren't going through that.
That's pretty radical.
Yeah. So, that is love beyond emotion.
Yes.
That's value that you can't put a price on monetarily whatsoever.
Right.
So, that being said, I do want to switch this more toward New Covenant here. We're almost at an hour, but I think we have enough time to at least slip this kind of last piece in. The church itself is called the bride of Christ.
Right.
Not churches, multiple.
Right.
He didn't take multiple brides. And by the way, in reverse, that bride isn't to take multiple husbands.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
It's just between Christ and us as the church body.
Mhm.
And I know for some people who aren't used to the biblical positioning of this, and just hear the churchese and pull out their bingo cards on
Right,
the
right.
the bride of Christ, they might think that's creepy. What do you mean? He's a man, and I'm a man, and he's a man, and he's going to marry like all of us? Like, what is that? I realize that might sound odd to you if
Yeah.
you don't fully understand that, but that is who we are. It's a relational covenant.
Right.
I mean, it really is based on, he's describing the covenant itself, correct?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think we all need to realize too that we are not individually the bride of Christ. So can we understand this? Like
Collectively. We're collectively.
Correct. Yeah, we're not like individually I'm the bride of Christ. No, you're not. We are only collectively the bride. So we're only the bride as the church. So or we're only the bride as a collective whole. So I think it helps everyone needs to understand that. You know, we're not individuals that are the individual brides of Christ. Like that isn't it. It's like the church.
He's not taking on millions of brides.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the church is the bride of Christ, and we are part of the church. So we are part of the bride. We aren't the bride herself. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I think
but
it's a
we
good
get all
distinction.
rights and privileges
Oh yeah,
of that covenant relationship.
absolutely.
And where my mind goes is back to what you said very early in this episode, where you talked about the guy showing up to the wedding with the wrong clothes.
Right.
And the fact that in that culture, you would have been sent the correct wardrobe to wear. My mind immediately went to the fact that we're robed with righteousness.
Yep. That's right. That's exactly why he says that.
I mean, that is him giving us
Yes.
the clothes
Right.
to be the bride. And by the way, that being robed is a covenant thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thing
Yeah.
circles back to covenant and how marriage itself, regardless of whether it's between man and woman here in this world, or the church body and Christ himself is the head of the church, it is a true covenant relationship, and that is what your identity is found in, which is why, to me, you can't accept polygamy as an acceptable alternative.
Yeah. I mean, other than the other 100 reasons that
All the 1,000,003 you just listed out aside. Yeah.
Exactly. But I think it's just amazing that he literally sends us the robe of righteousness to enter into covenant with. Because you can't enter into covenant unless you're absolutely perfect. Like as you enter in, you are made perfect by the clothes sent to you.
Yeah.
And he's like, here, I mean, he gives it to you as a gift to enter into this so that you are perfect and holy and without spot or blemish, because you're literally taking on Jesus of
And-
righteousness.
And once again, amazing.
Yeah. Super cool.
So, well, all right. I think that brings us to the end of this episode. Hopefully, we've answered the question. I say we've. Hopefully, Nathan has answered your question.
I think you brought just
about
as
polygamy. So, all I can tell you, it's a bad thing. It's
much.
bad.
Don't do it.
It's not a good idea.
No, it's a bad plan.
Trust me. I can imagine it would make intimacy pretty hard. So,
I mean, there's so many things that are just so wrong at so many levels. And I've again counseled at least one woman who's come out of one.
it's incredible.
So,
Well, that's it for today. So a few things to leave you with. First, we're going to tell you how to get in touch with us. If you have questions just like this one, this was a question that we're fielding from somebody who sent that in that has listened to our episode so far. We're going to tell you some of those ways, starting with...
you can get a hold of me at unleashedministries.net and just click on the email button and that'll come right to me.
All right. And then you can also go to rocksaltcoaching.com, the Contact Us tab. You can also go to the Rock Salt Facebook page. And at the same time, we're going to tell you this. we are releasing a couple of things to help you out if you are listening to these podcasts. So there will be an episode journal coming out. Probably by the time this airs, it will be out, and you can find that on Amazon. It will allow you to listen to any episode that you want to listen to write down some of the things like the scriptures introduced, terms that are introduced, questions that you might have, give you some time or some space rather in that journal to capture your thoughts on that. And that way you can, if you are gleaning anything from these episodes, you can capture that and look back on those. And at the same time, there's not only a Soul Brothers version, there's an Unleashed version for both of the Unleashed podcasts as well. So I encourage you to go check those out. Order those on Amazon, take notes, and by all means, send in any questions that you have, and we'll be happy to answer those. But until that time, we appreciate it, and we'll see you next episode.